Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. Zev Brenner. To Chicago we go. With us right now is Rabbi Sholem Fishbane. He serves as the Kosher administrator for the Chicago Rabbinical Council, the CRC. He's also the executive director of the Associated Kashrus organizations called AKO, an umbrella group of major kosher certifying agencies. He's attended the Tel Aviv Yeshiva in Chicago, after which time he studied in Yeshiva Izmir in Yerushalayim for 8 years. And upon returning to this country in 1997, became the rabbi of the Saronic Synagogue in Buffalo, New York, and worked in the Orthodox Union as the OU's regional upstate director. And he's a sought-after speaker. He speaks at many groups. He's published many articles on kashrus, and he's an expert. So, Rabbi Fishbane, thank you for joining us. Shavua Tov. Rabbi Fishbane, can you hear me? Okay, if you just put on your microphone, we'll be able to hear you. Okay.
All righty.
Good. Okay, nice to speak with you. Thank you for joining us.
I'm going to go to a better area. So,
okay, so we're listening to you as you go to a better area. So tell us, first, let's look at the state of kashrus. We have so many products that are certified kosher today. So are we in a much better shape than we were 10 to 20 years ago as far as kashrus is concerned?
That's a great question. On one hand, we are for sure much better where there's just so many things around where one can get kosher food. You can go to the far places of the world and you'll find something. But I have to tell you, what I've noticed? That our success is our failure. And people have stopped looking and they're just taking things for granted. And the awareness of kashrus, like it was when you were growing up, when I was growing up, where we always looked at labels, we always, okay, is it kosher? We need to find out if it's kosher. People have taken for granted so much that they're unfortunately it's reversing back. It's a great study to be done to understand why we're reverting back to the old ways.
When you say reverting back to the old ways, what do you mean by that?
Assuming I how many times have I walked by the Garden State the stopover over there, and I've walked over to someone that just came out of Starbucks and said, listen, I happen to know a lot about Starbucks drinks. I researched it, and that refreshers you just bought is completely non-kosher. It has grape juice in it, not kosher grape juice, a very high percentage actually. And they'll say, what? It can't be. What is it? And my friend bought it. My other friend buys it all the time. I said, I'm just telling you the way it is. And they'll say, oh my gosh, thank you so much. This happens, unfortunately, so many times, and that's just with me. And, I studied it. I asked them, why did you think you can buy without kosher? So I don't know, Starbucks, what is it? That's just one out of many, many, many examples.
I thought it was only limited to Starbucks, because Starbucks people will drink Starbucks. They say it's only coffee. That also applies to other areas. I think people, don't they check for labels more and more these days, with the exception of whiskey and the Starbucks?
Yeah, that's exactly my point. I think it used to be that, again, I don't know what decade you grew up in, but certainly when I grew up, we were always checking for labels. But the people that are growing up today in a hub where there's no, it's like, you can compare it to is maybe an Eruv. If you grow up in a city where there's an Eruv, you don't think about not carrying on Shabbos. You learned in school about Eruv, you learned in yeshiva about Eruv, but you don't really live it. And I think that those of us that are growing up in very concentrated Jewish areas and hubs, that everything is kosher, there's no such thing as not kosher, they just assume. I once gave a speech about kosher. It was actually at the Aguda convention, and afterwards, a lady came over to me with her daughter. They live in Lakewood, and they said, you mentioned Pas Yisrael. It never occurred to us that there's a Krispy Kreme that they go to a lot. Krispy Kreme is a donuts chain. we never bothered to ask if it was Pas Yisrael, because it's definitely, we just assume it, it's near us and of course. I said, are you makbid on Chol of Yisrael? They said, oh, of course. I said, do you know it's not Chol of Yisrael? Like, you're starting with Pas Yisrael, and you can see the shock of revelation on their face, which to me is not, because I work in Kashrus. I'm also out of town. I would say the more out of town you are, as you mentioned, I'm in Chicago, the more out of town you are, the more you're still looking at labels, you're still looking for things. But the more in town you go, I'll say, there's just an assumption everything's kosher.
I know, I look at that, but I have to tell you, there is one problem, is that the kosher symbols on products are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You need to magnify glass and to find the kosher symbol, and you have to turn the package over a million ways to find it. I find that to be something that
nothing to do with aging, right?
no, it's getting, well, maybe it's aging too, but looking at the symbol, they're so small. And I remember some of the liquor products are getting certification. I remember seeing one just now which had an OU and maybe a Hasidic hashgacha, but it was so small. I mean, you can find it. Some of the stuff, like on the flavored seltzers, you got to really look very carefully because it's tiny. I'm not sure why they don't make it bigger for more people would buy it if they see the symbol.
I'll tell you that that's a good point, but we still want to be grateful for the fact that, unlike in Europe, a lot of the kosher places refuse to put any symbol whatsoever. They're afraid of anti-Semitism there. And wherever it is, wherever it's going, and we in America, at least, not only are they willing to put the symbol on the packaging, they're actually coming to us and they're saying, can you get us kosher? While in Europe and in other places, they're still needing to go to factories or establishments to see, would you be willing to go kosher? Because we have to have what to eat. So, we'll take what we can get. But it's a good point.
But I think in America may be a little different, because having a kosher symbol is also a marketing tool where people will buy the product, not just Jews, but Muslims, and yet people think that kosher is healthier. So you have a whole bunch of people may buy the product because they find the kosher symbol. They figure more eyes are looking at it than just
it's an amazing statistic. Menachem Lubinsky from Lubicom worked with a statistic company and basically found out that 75% of those that buy a product because it's kosher are not Jewish. 75%.
Right. So we're the engine that makes the whole thing run, but we're a small portion of those that are buying because it's kosher on it. So
that's chesed from Hashem, a chesed from Hashem.
No, it really is. So what are some of the problems we find in Kyle? You mentioned people not checking labels anymore. I know I'm always checking, and my kids are always checking labels to find if it's kosher. But part of the thing is there's so many kosher symbols out there. We don't always recognize the kosher symbols that we find in the products.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. There are over 1,500 kosher symbols in the world. And if you were to ask me, what do I spend most of my day doing? It's actually researching the other kosher symbols to see if they meet our standards. And we're from the few kosher agencies that have a list on our website, on our app, very popular lists. And one of them include some of the agencies that we approve of that meet our standards. And we do it just to help the consumer in this, going shopping. But a tremendous amount of time is meeting, researching. And I have to tell you, one of the things I'm very proud of is that this list that we list of has become so popular that many agencies have asked, what do we got to do to get approved? And we've gone down, we've done reviews free of charge, and made suggestions, and they have changed. They've hired new people, they changed standards, and 6 months later, when we're comfortable that they're at a higher standard, we'll approve them, and that is just helping Klal Yisrael with that. So we're very happy to partake in this overall kashrus awareness and kashrus upgrades.
Now, there are also areas that we may take it for granted. I was talking to some of your colleagues. There's a also a podcast with Kashrus and Kashrus awareness. So there, from what I understand, a particular problem signs with party planners.
Party planners, yes. So, it's so fascinating, the food world that we live in, where things have changed, our palates have changed. And one of the things that have changed is that the traditional caterer is somewhat being replaced by the party planner. The party planner used to be just someone, oh yeah, I'm overwhelmed, I just had a baby, I got to make a bris, I can't handle it, so we'll have the caterer come in, but the party planner will take care of maybe making sure it's nice, some props, making sure the tables are set nicely. Really, it was just about the room, the decor. And they slowly have emerged as the caterer. Now, what I mean by that, not the caterer making the food. That is still something that they go to a traditional caterer and will buy the food. But they're in charge of arranging the food. So you go to a party planner and say, I want to make a vort for, expect about 250 people, take care of it. No problem. So the party planner will call a caterer to get a drop off of sesame chicken, another one. But before you know it, even though they're not making the food, because the responsibility of the kashrus of the food is, and because of that, the kashrus goes through them, all sorts of questions come into place, all sorts of questions. And especially when we're dealing with party planners that work on Shabbos, because they're not necessarily Talmidei Chachamim themselves, or people that know Hilchas Shabbos well. And almost every single Shabbos, they'll run out of ice, so they'll tell the non-Jewish worker, go quickly pick up ice, not understanding you can't do that. You can't do malacha for a year on Shabbos, Amir La'akum and all that. There's Chazara, there's Shia, all the regular Hilchas Shabbos. But the party planners will be props, and the props will have been used for last week. They'll go to a rental, the dishes, where the dishes were used other weeks, figuring out what could it be. It's just cold, it's not a cellar, it's double harif. They'll get wines, that not understanding the differences between mevushal and non-mevushal. They'll go to, they'll bring in products that are weak hechsher, milchik fleishigs. And I think what's happened at the same time with the party planner. See, let me explain to you the most important thing that makes a party planner stay in business. There's no such thing as the word no. If a person hires a party planner to make their simcha or to make their party, and they have, bubbies, chalupshas, or, whatever it is, and that's the most famous thing that Bubby's famous for, they're serving it. Now, Bubby, I don't know her tradition. I don't know how from she is. I don't know if she knows how to even check there's a million things that can go wrong, or aunt, her the great aunt's famous Waldorf salad. There's a million of these type of things. These homemade things show up at parties that party planners run all the time, and that's number one. And the second thing the party planners do, because they need to have an edge, they're trying to find the best of everything. And what has been taken over completely from caterers, and we hear the caterers complaining, are home businesses, especially when COVID came and people found their inner chef, and they found, they were at home, they couldn't do much. They started tinkering around in the kitchen, and they actually were pretty good in it. They started putting it on Instagram or wherever it is that they have these products available for sale. And before you knew it, the home business exploded. And they do not have a share, the majority of them. The party planner has picked up that, if I want to have challahs, I'll go to this person. If I want to have sweets, I'll go to the other person. And there's so many halachas, there's so many. The bottom line is, most recently there was a cold kore that were put out by incredibly important and chashuve poskim in America, Rabbi Shmuel Kamenetsky, or Rabbi Forsheimer, or Rabbi Shlomo Miller from Canada, or Shmuel first from Chicago, writing that home businesses need a hechsher no different than a restaurant. anyone that makes a product for profits, for sale, needs some sort of oversight. That's a halacha, that's the minhag, that's just the way
Well,
it is.
why would that be the case? If I'm not for profit, if I'm inviting 100 people to my house, so I don't need hashgacha. You're going to trust me because I have a nemanis, I have a trust.
Right.
If I all of a sudden want to send that hamantashen and make a business out of it, so what changes? How does my kashrus level change because I'm in a commercial business?
Right. I mean, it's a great question, and I do want to point out that most recently, in the most recent RJJ, I don't know if you know the RJJ journal they put out, Journal of Allah and Contemporary Society, the one that came out literally last week. Rabbi Reese, the Av Bezdin of the CRC, wrote a phenomenal article on that very question. In other words, what is the difference between someone that goes from profit to nonprofit, where he has nemanis or not? And he gave all of the marmakomos and all of the back and forth. It was a really, really great article. And of course, you can pick that up, and we'll be putting it on our website shortly. But you know, the basic, I mean, what you're asking is what Chazal say. Chazal say many, many times, when a person has nagias, as soon as a person, the same Hashem, the same Ribono Shalom that created the halachos and created us, said in the Torah, that shoichad, as soon as money gets involved, we don't even realize ourselves how we cut corners, we think, we rationalize. That's the simple makeup of the human being.
Why does that change? If it's first of all, it used to be years ago that if you had a Shomer Shabbos individual, he was trusted. If he had a restaurant, it's only at some point where you had the hashkachas we had to have for a restaurant. What makes Shohad different for an individual than for a kashrus group? They have the same money incentive too.
Reverting actually addresses that as well. So a true kashrus agency, and it's a good question. A true kashrus agency, let's say me, I'll talk about myself. My salary doesn't change whether I drop a company or I don't drop a company. And I feel zero pressure if I need to do what I need to do and enforce kashrus, because you don't want to be under kosher CRC, that's fine with me. Honestly, it is. Now the setup is because I work for a set of a CRC is not a privately owned hechsher. Your question would be much more relevant for a privately owned hechsher. That's a good question. But if you work for a kehilo hechsher like I do, there's no problems. And I have a pretty surprising thing to tell you. We lose a tremendous amount of money every single year on food service accounts. That means if we would take away all of our restaurants and all of our caterers, we would finally start making some money, because it's incredibly there's many layers to do it right. We have someone that's dedicated to bugs. We have many other things, and then what we need to do is we subsidize it from our factories. So for us, it's actually the opposite. To answer your question,
when you have a restaurant, for example, and you have a mashgiach, a supervisor, they're getting paid, I believe, from the restaurant. Their salary's being taken care of, not from the kashrus group. So how are you losing money? How's a kasher losing money when the expenses are being paid for by the restaurant or a store owner?
Well, you're just referring to the mashgiach on premise, okay?
Correct.
And some agencies do pay directly. Some agencies can't afford to be the bank of the restaurant. It's a workers' comp issue. That's one of the reasons. Ideally, of course, the restaurant should. So it's not necessarily a given that every time the restaurant's paying the mashgiach. What I was referring to, though, was the setup in the agency, where, let's say, there's various people in charge. So there's a yotziv and nichnas. I'll talk about the CRC because obviously that's what I know best. There's myself, I'm the administrator. There is a full salaried person who studies the life cycle of insects and trains all of our mashgichim and goes into the restaurants, takes a sample of their already checked produce to make sure they still know what they're doing. and he's, as I said earlier, he understands the life cycles and he goes for training all the time. No one's reimbursing him. That's coming out of the small amount that we'll charge a restaurant for the extra. Then there's something called an RC, a Rabbinical coordinator, that's in charge of our food service accounts. Then there's someone we pay a yotze v'nichnas. He goes on a beat. He goes from restaurant to restaurant. Throughout the week, over and over and over again. So when you're talking to mashgiach, there's 4 or 5 critical people on top of him, each one doing another part of the job to have a very good food service account. And that's why we lose so much money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, by the way.
But don't the restaurants also pay for some of the orders? The mashgichim are paid for, let's say by the restaurant, and they also pay a fee to the Kashrus organization, which could be
Right, so if we would crunch the numbers of what our costs are to charge the restaurants to cover the fees like what you're mentioning now, it would be significantly higher than what we really charge. We charge so low is because we are in a community and our goal is to have kosher food for our constituents here in the city. So we made a decision to charge much less than it really costs us in order for them to have that. And therefore, that's why we lose money. And there are some communities that really only have food service accounts where the only way they can make money is by fundraising, paying their people much less. There's various ways, or they just lose money every year. But do not think that a hechsher, a vad, a kashrus in a community is not necessarily making a profit. That's the honest truth.
Rabbi Sholem Fishbane is our guest. He's a Kashrus administrator for the Chicago Rabbinical Council. That's the CRC. Also the executive director of the Associated Kashrus Organizations, AKO, which is an umbrella group for Kashrus organization. We're looking at the state of Kashrus, some things that you may know, some things that you may not know regarding Kashrus.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program, Mom. Zev Brenner, our guest is Rabbi Sholem Fishbane, the Kosher administrator of the Chicago Rabbinical Council, CRC, and also the executive director of the Associated Kashrus Organization, AKO, an umbrella group. How many groups, by the way, belong to the AKO?
About 125 agencies are members of ours, which there's a set of standards, a minimum standards that they have to agree to and follow, rather, and then of course they have to be voted in by the ACO executive board, which consists of the heads of the major agencies. And Baruch Hashem, it's been a tremendous help for Kashrus in general. All behind the scenes, most people don't know it exists. It's not meant to be a public organization. It's just there to help each other set minimum standards, to set policies, to help each other, to have the biggest minds on any particular, let's say, project or particular subject that comes up.
There's been a controversy about some of this fake meat, this one that's created in the lab meat, whether it's meat, parva, whatever it might be. Is that something which you're trying to set a standard for all the kashrus groups?
No. Well, what we did is we had several high-level speakers. Or Basher Weiss came in and to speak. We have conventions every year, so he came to speak about that and gave his view.
Which kashrus organization gives a certification for the convention? Don't you have a competition? Or every year you give it to somebody else?
We all end up drinking water. That's it,
You certification for water too?
Right, that's true. The only thing we actually give a hechsher on ACO is Kosher Fest, where it was getting out of hand. Of course, it never had. And people, this is again, it's that assumption thing we were talking earlier about. People were coming to Kosher Fest thinking Kosher Fest, it must be kosher. And they were just grabbing and eating. And, the Kosher Fest people weren't necessarily taking responsibility. And one year there was a terrible story where, every year there was stories, but one year we just hit home where somebody was selling tortillas just plain old tortillas, and obviously you're not going to sample tortillas. So you went next door to Walmart and bought a bunch of turkey roll, non-kosher, and wrapped it in tortillas, and people assuming that the hechsher on the tortilla also, was made in a factory, was also on the turkey roll tortilla that they were sampling, which was completely non-kosher. At
I
that
think
point,
at the Hebrew National, first year of the Kosher Fest, I went in where was it, in New York City?
Javits.
So Hasidim meeting Hebrew National, so I went over and I just was surprised because Hebrew National is not a lot, but I saw a lot of them eating.
There you go. Perfect.
That
It's,
was one
there's
of the
that.
first
Yeah, that's assumption. It must be kosher for us. Like what, right? So we that's the only time of year we actually give a hechsher, which basically means in order to have a booth there, you need to be either an ACO member or we check you, whatever, something like that. We look and we have a mashgiach that goes around for us.
Let's go to Ari Motion, Lower East Side Manhattan. You have a question for Rabbi Fishbane. Go ahead, please.
I assume the website is akakosher.org. Is that correct?
ACOkosher.org. Yes.
And what percentage of the people that you checked out met your requirement?
Reb Zev, can you repeat the
Can
question?
you repeat the question? I didn't quite understand it.
What percentage of the organizations that they checked out met their standards?
What organ that they check out?
Oh, I think, okay, I know what he's asking. He's asking out of the 1,500 kosher agencies that that I mentioned earlier, how many of them meet our standards? Surprisingly, only about 200, 250 out of the 1,500. Quite a low percent. Quite a low percent.
What are your standards that they don't adhere to?
It usually comes down to the amount of, this is a subject that could take us hours, but it usually comes down to the amount of actual visitations. Aside for halacha, which, assuming everyone today that's involved in kashrus knows enough about halacha, we're not talking about that, but we're talking about structure of being able, first, you have to, honestly, today to be in hashgacha, you really need to understand chemistry, you need to understand food science, you need to understand how to marry all these things together with halacha, and you have to have a good system in place. So if I ask them how many times did you visit that flavor house, well, we can only afford to go once a year because that's all they're paying us. A very common answer, unfortunately. Flavor house is incredibly difficult to monitor. Once a year, I'm sorry, that's not our standard. That would be a daily example of something I deal with. That's where the finances of kashrus plays into play. Not that I want to say that kashrus is all, directly it's all about what the money is, but it is in a way. If you don't charge enough, you can't monitor enough, meaning you can't send your mashgiach enough because the mashgiach wants to be paid for his visit. So if you're chipping away at the amount of visits because you're not able to pay him more, you don't have a high standard. That's basically the short answer.
Ari Moshe, thank you for your question.
Thank you.
So I'm going to get to some email questions in just a moment, but here's a question for you. Is the perception out there is that all the major kashrus organizations, when it comes to big companies, they rely on all kinds of coolers, all kinds of leniencies, mirsos, they know that that people are going to be, afraid of the government, so therefore they're not going to substitute regular milk, non-cow milk for regular milk. When it comes to the restaurants, they're more strict. Is that the case? You mentioned that they make money from these companies, but the mashgiach may only go out once or twice a year.
No, so it's a good question, but it's not comparable at all because a restaurant is something that almost every single minute a new kashrus situation arises. That means every time you make a salad, and every time they cook a dish which has the halachas of Bishul Yisrael, or you make a salad which has the insect issues and all that, you need a mashgiach to maintain and to monitor that it's kosher. A factory that's making the same cookie day in, day out, and gets in once a month, their ingredients, we set up a hashgacha. Let me give you the bottom line with this. When we set up a hashgacha in a factory, we set it up in a way it is as if we were there the entire time. We know how often they're getting, as I said, ingredients. We know how we make a schedule based on making sure that nothing would have happened when we were there or not there. So it really is the same. But like in a shechita, every animal it's a new day, it's a new fact. There's new shilas because every animal is different. So you have a whole slew of shochtim and botkim and mashgichim in a shechita. Restaurants are very similar to that. Every time an order comes in, this guy wants tilapia with a baked potato and sour cream on the side and a mix of greens. There's 14 new shilas that are coming up right then and there, and therefore you need a very competent mashgiach to make sure it goes out kosher l'mahader.
Let's take another phone call. Let's go to my good friend Ezra in Borough Park. Good luck,
Hi,
Ezra.
good luck. So I have a question for the Rav that's on my mind. So, for example, here in Borough Park, we have many halls that rent out their facilities to whoever pays them for the night. In other words, it could be a caterer, it could be a private person. My question to you is, does the facility need a hechsher to verify who is the caterer on a nightly basis? For example, Sunday night it could be caterer A, Monday night it could be caterer B. How do I know who was the caterer the night before? In other words, yes, everyone assumes that the caterer that's coming in has a hechsher, and I assume they do, but I could be coming in and bringing my own food and using the same oven that someone is using that used it last night and someone else will be using it tomorrow night. So isn't that a breach in kashrus? Just curious your take on this. And I'm amazed that no one has ever brought this issue up, because here you have many shuls, many yeshivas that have catering halls, especially some of the smaller shuls. They rent it out on a nightly basis to different people. There is no exclusive caterer that obviously would have a hechsher. Now, the assumption is that everyone who uses the hall is bringing in a caterer with a hechsher, but there's no guarantee. That's my question.
So, I thought I understood your question, but now I'm unclear, and I'll tell you what I mean. There's really two scenarios. One is a catering hall that brings in a caterer. The next night caterer, I know what we do. When we go into anywhere, we assume that everything until now was not kosher. Therefore, we kosher. I don't, even if we're going to, the local, very frum yeshiva, or, the yeshiva himself came in and whatever it is, we never, ever go in without koshering, because we have to have that policy across the board.
Even though it's an ACO member?
It doesn't make a difference. It's a policy across the board, but thank you for bringing that up. But what I thought, then towards the end of your question, when you start talking about simcha halls in a shul, incredibly good point. And I want to really explain, Reb Zev, we were talking earlier about assumptions. When you go to a shul, and because I work in Kosher, so this is a hobby of mine, I'll go over to random people like at a vart and say, and there's hot dishes out and all of that. And I'll say, did you ask about if this place has a hechsher? He says, of course not. You know the row of the shul is? It's harav hagoyin, whatever, fill in the blank. Truly very chashuv a person. Then I'll go over to the harav hagoyin of that shul. I'll either call him the next day or meet him, and I'll say, do you take responsibility for the simcha hall in your basement? He says, absolutely not. I said, but do you understand when you're going to, I don't know, let's, pick a good Jewish name, Rabbi Cohen Shul, Rabbi Goldberg Shul, that there's an assumption that, of course, because it's in your basement and it's called Rabbi Cohen or Rabbi Goldberg Shul, that people assume they could eat there, and it turns out it was homemade food from Aunt Sally and who knows. And he says, it can't be. I don't believe it. I said, I've been doing this for a long time, and this is I'm straight up the way it is. And that's where this conscious awareness of bringing this point out. So your caller's point is a very good point, that do not assume that it's in a simcha hall, and especially if it's attached to a shul, there's anybody taking responsibility. And if there's one message we can walk away from our call today, please ask the question. Just like you would never go to a restaurant without a hechsher, the same too is you shouldn't go to any simcha, any kiddush. Just ask who's responsible for kashrus. Hopefully the answer will be easy.
My point is, when you go to a simcha, you see the caterer, and you understand that the caterer has a hechsher. My point is that the facility itself has multitudes of different caterers during the course of a week. There isn't an exclusive caterer.
Okay, so then the first
I go to shul A Sunday night. Mr. Goldberg is the caterer. Monday night, I as a private family could rent that hall and bring my food and use their oven, and I certainly don't have a hechsher. Tuesday night, a different caterer shows up. There is no one that's at the door and saying, "Hey, caterer, let me see your hechsher. Thank you. I'm signing off on it." Monday night, "Hey, family X, you are using this facility, but you don't have a hechsher. Sorry, you can't use the facility." No one checks, no one verifies, no one asks questions. This is what goes on here in Borough Park.
Right. So again, let me just address that, and hopefully we can make some changes tonight. If you're going to an affair that has a hechsher, and it's a good hechsher, you can assume that had hechsher koshered before they started their.
They did not. No, that they did not. I know this for a fact.
Okay,
No
that's very sad to hear them. Then it's a question. It's a question on their standard. I'm sorry to say that. I'm surprised and saddened to hear that. But I'm what I've seen and what I'm used to. A legitimate good hechsher will never walk in without koshering beforehand. So hopefully your call will generate a new movement.
But here's the thing, though. The assumption is, whether you're at a simple hall, is that if you're a caterer, see, Ezra's question is, if you have a caterer walking on Wednesday night, which is a very reliable hashgacha, he assumes that the place is kosher, that Tuesday night's caterer also has a high standard. He's not going to kosher the place again. He's going to go in and just serve as he normally would, as if it would be in his own catering place, because he figures the place is reliable. That's where I think.
Exactly. I'm not making any accusations. I'm not in the kosher business. I'm just an observer, and I assume. I mean, don't assume anything. But I'm just amazed that no one has ever brought this issue to the
fore.
Yeah, I mean, it's just everyone assumes that it's sort of the internal trusting system. You assume that everyone's going, and I assume that's the way it really is. That's what's really transpiring, of people only using reliable hechsher, because if you want to eat tray from Borough Park, you have a hard time finding someone to serve you tray. So yes, I'm assuming that every caterer is, but there's always that random bad apple that could have made that oven non-kosher, and no one would be the wiser. That's my whole point, because you're using different caterers. The catering hall is owned by a shul. The shul says, "Okay, you want to rent my facility? Give me $500 and it's yours." They don't stand by the door and check the hashgacha of the person bringing in the food. That's my point.
Excellent point. And Ezra, thank you for a good point.
Thanks.
But by the way, I know the shuls that I go, when I make a kiddush, they always ask who the hashgacha that I'm bringing in. It has to go through the Rav. So I'm surprised that I hear when they have these simcha halls that the Rav of the shul is not asking the people making a kiddush or a party who the hashgacha is. I know they always ask me.
Yeah,
In various shuls.
I wonder if it's specific to the caller set from Borough Park. I can certainly speak to the communities that I'm familiar with. That is not the case. Maybe this is a specific problem to that area, but most of the communities that I'm familiar with do kosher ahead of time, or the Rav takes responsibility like you said, Reb Zev. So hopefully it's just a specific, area that has to be dealt with.
Our guest is Rabbi Sholem Fishbane, the Kosher administrator for the Chicago Rabbinical Council. That's the CRC. He's also executive director of the Associate Kosher Organization, AKO, an umbrella group of the major kosherist organization. We're looking at the state of kosher. How kosher is our question.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Our guest is Rabbi Sholem Fishbane, the Kosher's administrator of the Chicago Rabbinical Council, CRC, and director of the Associated Kosherist Organizations. Okay, we're going to get to some of your questions, some of your emails. And here's a question from BC. Does your guest organization supervise any Pesach programs? I know the OU doesn't.
The CRC does supervise at least two. One is Gateways, which is this year going to be in the Phoenix, Arizona area. And the second one is KMR, that they're going to the Waldorf Astoria in Cancun. I must tell you that Pesach programs are incredibly hard to supervise. I actually even wrote an article once on deciding how to decide which Pesach program to go from a caterers. I think it was called 10 questions to ask your Pesach program. Rava Machshir, it was printed in Mishpacha magazine. And it really comes down to, in my opinion, the amount of mashkichim Rava Machshir will be bringing. If you have a program that has 800, 900 or 1,000 people, and you're only bringing, 5, 6, 7, 8 mashkichim, it's usually a very bad sign. We traditionally have been bringing to our programs in the 20s, mashkichim, 20, 25 mashkichim, and we barely make it. So I must tell you that you need a lot of good coverage for a Pesach program. And it's unfortunately it's a flooded market, but there are many programs that do not meet our standard. So I do want to therefore point out that we talked earlier about our approved list. On the top I write that this approved list does not necessarily include Pesach programs. You need to check into that separately.
Let's go to Jeff in Borough Park. You have a question for our guest. Go ahead, Jeff in Borough Park.
First of all, I work in catering. I'm a caterer waiter. Okay. Now I have to tell you right now, I'm a floor worker. I'm not a manager. I'm not a captain. I'm not a whatever. I'm not the balabas. I actually give the food to the people. But the majority of waiters are not Jewish, and they play all kinds of games. And I've been doing this for years, and you cannot trust them. Most of them, they're immigrants of various dubious status, whatever. They have a taina against Jews in general, and particularly against any of these bosses, because they know they're making low wages. Half the time they don't get paid on time, but that's another story. So they take it out. They're constantly being told, don't do this and don't do that, so they do just the opposite. And I'm going to tell you, you're doing a 10-hour shift at some of these places, and these guys don't eat gefilte fish, and they don't eat cholent, they don't eat that kind of stuff. They don't eat kigel. They eat their own food, and they bring it with them. And most of the food they eat is chazer. I'm telling you that. And I've seen them put the chazer into the ovens and heat up their food, and in the Shabbos oven.
So why do you have them working for you? Why do you have them working for you if they're doing this?
You didn't hear what I said. I'm not the owner. I told you that 3 times. I said I'm not the owner. I'm not the manager. I am a regular worker. Okay. The solution is to hire only Jewish waiters. That is the solution, and the hashgacha is to demand that the waiters themselves be Jewish, because you can. First of all, there's all kinds of halachas concerning. There's a certain amount of minutes, nichnas something anyway, that you cannot serve a non-Jew cannot hold that food for a certain amount of time without a yid actually watching it. And I'm going to give you an example. Like when people get up to do the tanzen in the simcha, that's when we put down the meat on the table, okay, or the fish on the table. So they're not looking at it. So for 10 minutes, nobody's looking at the food there, okay? So unless you're sitting exactly by the kitchen where it comes out immediately.
Yeah, but the kitchen, and they're not bringing pork from someplace else.
They're not ringing pork. I just told you there's another halacha. The halacha is there cannot be a certain distance in time between the time the food is prepared by the cook, who's hopefully a yid, and the time it's served to the person eating it.
I'll let
who's a
Rabbi,
yid.
let me let Rabbi Fishbane
It's
respond.
from
to you.
Nitnach La'ayin, something like that. I'm surprised you don't know about it.
I'm gonna let Rabbi Fishbane address you. Go ahead, Rabbi Fishbane. I'll let you
Yeah,
tap.
the halacha of Yosef, and he's referring to Yosef, Basar Shen Salam Min Ha'ayin. That's what
That's
he's
from
referring.
the eye. But then
Yeah.
would that hold true in a catering hall where there are people walking in
But
and out?
you need to have a reasonable cause to worry about it. So if you are in an area where there's a flow from the kitchen to the dining room, and the waiter would have no benefit at all, whether personal or financial benefit, to go ahead and to make a switch that would be a very strong case why it's not a problem, even if the mashgiach doesn't keep his eye on it. And number two is there's something called tviyas ayin, and that really is what sometimes we'll get a call from someone that ordered downtown a dish from Uber Eats, and the simanim weren't strong, or there was no siman, whatever it is, and they'll get a call. So we'll arrange even like a Zoom conversation between the mashgiach and the person that got it, where the mashgiach has what's called a tviyas ayin, where he can say halachically, eid echad, yes, that is the food. That's exactly the food that I sent to you. Then that would be the same over here in this case, where while there might be a time by the time they finish that dance, but the caterer, the from people involved, will have a tefillah sign that that's what they prepared in their kitchen, so therefore it'd be less of a problem. Then, regarding your other points about the character of some of these waiters, and obviously that's a much bigger conversation to be had, but I can't say that it's a halachic concern that therefore you can't eat the food at this point.
Okay, thank you for your question. I'm going to read one email, take one more phone call. We'll try to squeeze in a couple more. Okay. Oh, let's take the phone call again. I believe we have Ezra back. Ezra, you have another question for our guest.
Yeah, another question. Thank you, Zev. It's a very interesting program. Rabbi, I go to
Yes.
many functions that have a kosher table. So I show up at the kosher table. It's obviously it's a non-kosher event. It's normally associated with a business or political function where they want to be sensitive to their kosher guests. And you show up at the table, someone from is eating from the food, from the cold cuts or whatever they're giving. And it's all, the wrapper is off. And I said, were you here when you opened? And he says, no, I just see kosher table. And the simanim are not there. In other words, sometimes the simanim are there and sometimes it's not. What is the halacha? I refrain from eating because I'm just afraid you just mentioned.
You're a smart man, Ezra. Yes, that would not be allowed if you can't ascertain that someone with the halacha of ne'manis could assure you that what is in front of you indeed came kosher, came in with the proper simanim. There's no mashgiach in sight to look over the whole party. It's a big problem. That would be the earlier calls about Basar Shen Solomon Ayin. This would be a case where we do need to worry about Basar Shen Solomon Ayin, because there's no beginning and end to the supervision to undo the worries of Basar Shen Solomon Ayin.
So
Excellent.
even if there was a cold cut platter and it had the name of a galat kosher caterer, but it was ripped apart. I mean, in other words, someone opened it up and you see the sticker on the floor, or moved to the
I'm going to tell you a very, very scary story that
I just want to know the halacha. I'm not arguing. I just want to know.
I don't think that listen, we can talk in learning. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about. There's a difference if it's a daraisa, which is a meat platter, versus the rabbanon. How many simanim does it need? But if you walk in, it's no different than on a plane. If let's say they come to you and they already took off the simanim and they made it for you, They wanted to be nice, and the stewardess came over and took off all the wrappings because they thought they were doing you a favor, and it turned out like, oh no, now I can't eat it. It's very similar to that thing. So the halacha would be you would need to find some sort of a stronger in halacha to undo basar salayim, other than there's a wrapper nearby. And I'm going to share with you a very scary story. Rabbi David Babad from Tarnopol just told me that it happened recently. Okay, and I don't want to, this isn't the norm, but it's something that he was on his game, and yasher koach to him that he caught it. Basically, he's involved with, I guess, some catering place or a supermarket where they have a sushi section, and a call came in to the kosher supermarket that does sushi to have platters of sushi made to be delivered as a drop-off for someplace. He was on the other end of the receiving of the sushi. It actually came in with a box of tape that had on it the I think it was his hechsher. I don't remember the detail, but he just said, I need to check for the proper amount of simanim. And he opened up the box, and believe it or not, it was absolutely not kosher. Now, what happened? The person that took the call, the person that was in charge of the sushi station, has a private business of non-kosher sushi. He's not a Jewish guy. He may have been a sushi chef. He has his own business. And, he said to himself, I can take this call and have the supermarket make the profit, or I can do my own little, and that's exactly what he did. And he had access to the tape, whatever it is. Rabbi David got on it and made sure, but he just had an intuition to open up that box, and it was actually non-kosher fish. I mean, really mintame, and certainly bishalakum on the rice and all the other terrible things. So, that would have been a case where, oh, look, it looks like there's a piece of tape somewhere and it must be good. But a very astute mashgiach like himself was able to pick it up and undo it. That's the story that recently happened. He just shared it with us, and it's crazy. So therefore, to answer your point, Chazal were very, very smart in making, not that they need our haskama, but Chazal understood the way people are built and the halachas, and therefore, just the fact that there's a lid somewhere that you can assume came from this is not enough. It's something that you most probably would have to, on the spot, either call a reb.
Right, if the kosher table has cookies or fish, or does that make it any easier, or based on the story that you just said? In other words, if you go to an event and you see there's a kosher section, but it has kosher cookies, in other words, but it's ripped up already, the platter, or tuna fish sandwiches, does that make it any easier?
Again, it starts if you're dealing with the rices, the rabbanans, depending on how many simanim you need. Obviously, if it's a box of Reisman cookies, and the Reisman cookies, then we all pretty much know what Reisman cookies kind of look like. So you have what I said earlier about Tvias Ayin. But otherwise, there's really, and I'm sorry I can't help you more, because there's literally every situation is going to have a different set of parameters. But
Anyway, Ezra, thank you for your phone call. I appreciate it. We're almost out of time. A quick story. There was a bank in Borough Park called the Greater New York Savings Bank, no longer in business. I'm talking about a decade, maybe 20 years ago. The president of the bank was an Irish individual. The vice president was a Jew. It's Borough Park. He said you got to have a kosher table. So you got to have kosher food. So the president says, make a table kosher. The vice president was a smart guy. He made the whole thing kosher, just put a kosher sign on one of the tables. The president was thinking he's eating treif, he's eating kosher. And meanwhile, the whole thing was kosher, was Borough Park. Interesting story. Last email question. So Perry writes, the problem Ezra was talking about doesn't really happen in Borough Park, because most small halls that get rented out do not have kitchens to kosher. Whoever rents it brings in outside ready food. Halls that have a kitchen have an exclusive caterer. Just what Perry writes.
It's good to know that. It's good to end on a positive note that way. Thank you.
Quick question. What's the CRC? What's your policy regarding buying lettuce that's triple washed without certification?
No way. We check it all day. We find so many bugs. I mean, we
With triple,
literally,
even with triple wash?
we buy triple. As I told you earlier, we have someone on staff that all he does is check. That's his entire job. And one of the things I give him is keep buying that triple wash stuff and keep checking it. And he comes back to me, it is full of bugs. And they have to know how they wash it. Because they reuse the water. You have to know the flume systems and all that. So there's just no way you can rely on that.
Rabbi Sholem Fishbane, we have to have you back, Kosher Administrator for the Chicago Rabbinical Council, Executive Director of the Associate Kosher Organization. If people want to learn more about what you're doing in Kashrus, how can they get in touch with you?
We have obviously our website, crckosher.org. And there's also involved in this kashrusawareness.com is a great way of you put out these little videos, a couple minute videos once a week about the lasest.
I think
sorry?
Sholem, I thank Sholem for putting us together. I think they also have some podcasts as well.
Yes, podcasts and all that. Kashrus awareness campaign, and you can get it WhatsApp to you. So we're very, very, that really was the answer to what we talked about earlier in our program today. But how do we get people to just know enough to ask the question? So we're doing these things. We're very, very happy with that and proud of that. And I'll be happy to come back at any time you'd like.
I thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, Cole, thank you.
And we've been looking at